The night I stopped explaining myself didn't begin with a decision. It began with exhaustion. The kind of emotional exhaustion that comes after too many conversations where you speak carefully, choose your words, soften your feelings, and still feel misunderstood. That night, emotional silence didn't feel dramatic or intentional. It felt necessary. I had spent so long trying to explain what I felt, why I felt it, and how deeply it mattered, that something inside me finally went quiet. Not angry, not bitter, just tired of explaining love, tired of asking to be heard, tired of translating my own emotions so someone else wouldn't feel uncomfortable. I remember realizing, in that moment, how much emotional energy I had been spending just to maintain connection. Explaining myself had become a routine, clarifying my feelings, justifying my reactions, softening my words so they wouldn't sound like needs. And somewhere along the way, emotional distance crept in. Not because I didn't care, but because caring had turned into constant explanation. That night, when I stopped explaining, I didn't expect anything to change. I didn't expect a reaction. I didn't expect clarity. I only knew that continuing to explain felt heavier than staying silent. There was no argument that night. No dramatic ending. No final conversation where everything came out perfectly. Just a pause. A long one. I noticed how strange it felt not to fill the silence with words. Not to rush in and explain what I meant, or what I didn't mean, or how I really felt underneath it all. The silence sat there, unfamiliar and uncomfortable, like an unanswered question. And part of me wondered if this quiet would push everything further apart, or if it would finally reveal what words never could. As the hours passed, something subtle began to happen. Not outside of me, but inside. Without the constant need to explain myself, I could finally hear my own thoughts clearly. I realized how often I had been speaking from a place of fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being ignored. Fear of being seen as too much. And in that quiet space, another feeling surfaced. Relief. Small at first, almost unnoticeable, but real. The kind of relief that comes when you stop performing your emotions for someone else. I didn't know it then. But that night was the beginning of a shift. Not a dramatic transformation. Not a sudden change in someone else. But a quiet movement inside me. One that would change how I saw silence, connection, and myself. And as I sat there, saying nothing, I wondered what would happen next. Would the silence create more distance? Or would it finally make space for something honest to emerge? After that night, I started noticing how deeply explaining had shaped my relationships. It wasn't just about communication. It was about effort. About how often I felt responsible for making sure everything was understood, softened, clarified, and safe. Explaining had slowly become my way of keeping things together, even when I felt myself growing tired. And once I stopped, I couldn't ignore how much space it suddenly created. Space to feel. Space to observe. Space to question whether connection should really require so much constant translation. I began to reflect on how easily we confuse love with effort. How often we believe that if we just explain ourselves better, more clearly, more patiently, things will finally shift. I had believed that for a long time. That understanding was something I had to earn through words, through repetition, through emotional labor. But silence has a way of exposing patterns that conversation often hides. Without my explanations filling the gaps, the dynamic revealed itself in ways I hadn't expected. There was a quiet discomfort in not stepping in to explain myself. It felt unnatural at first, like I was withholding something important. I worried about being misread. I worried about being misunderstood on purpose. But beneath that discomfort was a deeper realization. I had been explaining not only to be heard, but to be accepted, to be chosen. And that realization stayed with me, lingering longer than any conversation ever had. As days passed, I started to notice small changes in how I felt. Not relief alone, but clarity. Without constantly explaining my emotions, I could finally see them as they were, without editing them for someone else's comfort. I noticed how much of my energy had been spent anticipating reactions, preparing explanations in advance, rehearsing conversations that might never happen. And in that awareness, a new question emerged. What happens when you stop carrying the emotional weight alone? This story isn't about silence as punishment. It's not about withdrawing to prove a point or forcing someone to react. It's about what happens internally when you stop explaining yourself long enough to hear your own truth. And as I continued forward, unsure of where this quiet shift would lead, I sensed that the hardest part was still ahead, facing what silence might reveal when there was nothing left to explain. The first thing I noticed after I stopped explaining myself was the silence itself. It wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with everything I had been saying for months, maybe years. Every unspoken clarification hovered in the air, like unfinished sentences waiting for permission to exist. I realized how often I had rushed to fill those spaces, afraid that silence meant disconnection. Now, without my words rushing ahead, the quiet stayed longer than I was used to. At first, I told myself this was temporary, that I would eventually explain again, just with better words, more carefully chosen sentences. But days passed, and I didn't feel the urgency return. Instead, I felt something else rising slowly. Awareness. I began to notice how often conversations had relied on me to keep them moving, smoothing over discomfort before it could even surface. Without my explanations, the balance felt different, uneven in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. I paid attention to how I behaved in small moments, how I paused before responding, how I stopped anticipating questions that never came. I noticed how much of my communication had been preemptive, designed to avoid confusion before it happened. And in that observation, a quiet truth emerged. I had been doing emotional work that wasn't being shared. Explaining had become my way of carrying the relationship forward on my own. There were moments when the silence felt uncomfortable enough to break. Times when I almost stepped back into my old habit, ready to explain what I was feeling and why it mattered. My mind rehearsed familiar phrases, explanations shaped by fear rather than truth. But each time, something held me back. Not pride, not anger, but a growing sense that explaining again would only return me to the same place I was trying to leave. As I stayed quiet, I began to notice responses that I hadn't seen before. Pauses where there used to be assumptions, questions that didn't come right away, a subtle shift in attention. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden confessions or emotional breakthroughs, just small changes in rhythm, like the tempo of a conversation slowing enough for something real to surface. And I wondered if my silence was creating space that words never had. At the same time, I was forced to sit with my own discomfort. Silence doesn't only reveal the other person, it reveals you. Without the distraction of explaining, I couldn't avoid my own feelings. The doubt, the hope, the quiet fear that maybe my words had been the only thing holding everything together. That thought lingered longer than I wanted it to, challenging me to confront how much of my sense of connection depended on being understood. I started asking myself questions I had avoided before. Why did I feel responsible for clarity? Why did I believe misunderstanding meant failure? And why did being heard feel like something I had to earn through effort? These questions didn't come with immediate answers, but they changed the way I saw my silence. It wasn't absence. It was a mirror, reflecting patterns I hadn't been ready to see. There was a strange calm that settled in as I stopped trying to manage the emotional temperature of every interaction. I felt less tense, less alert, less prepared to defend or explain myself. That calm wasn't peace yet. It was unfamiliar, almost unsettling. But it was real. And for the first time in a long while, I felt present instead of reactive. The more I stayed with that calm, the clearer something became. Explaining had been my way of holding on to control. Control over how I was perceived. Control over outcomes. Control over connection. Letting go of explanations meant letting go of that control, and trusting that whatever remained would be honest, even if it wasn't comfortable. By the end of that phase, I knew something had changed, even if I couldn't name it yet. Silence was no longer something to fear. It had become a test, not of patience, but of truth. And as I stood in that quiet space, I sensed that the next shift wouldn't come from staying silent alone, but from what that silence was about to reveal. As the silence stretched on, it stopped feeling like a reaction and began to feel like a position. Not something I was doing to make a point, but something I was standing in. I noticed how my body reacted differently now. Less tension in my shoulders, fewer thoughts racing ahead to predict outcomes. I wasn't waiting for the right moment to explain myself anymore. I was simply present, letting things unfold without interference. In that stillness, I became more observant. I started noticing details I had overlooked before. The timing of responses, the absence of curiosity, the way certain questions never came unless I prompted them. When I had been explaining constantly, these things blurred together. Now, without my words smoothing the edges, patterns appeared with uncomfortable clarity. Silence wasn't hiding the truth. It was exposing it. There were moments when the lack of explanation felt like loss. Not of connection, but of identity. For so long, being the one who explained had given me a role. I was the translator of feelings, the emotional bridge. Without that role, I had to face the question of who I was when I wasn't trying to be understood. That question stayed with me, heavy and unresolved. I realized how often I had mistaken effort for intimacy. I believed that the more I explained, the closer we were becoming. But intimacy doesn't grow from constant clarification. It grows from shared presence, from mutual curiosity, from two people leaning in at the same time. And in the quiet, I could finally see that I had been leaning forward alone for far too long. Without my explanations guiding the narrative, space opened for reactions I hadn't allowed before. Hesitation, confusion, even moments of reaching out that felt different, slower, less assumed. It wasn't consistent, and it wasn't dramatic, but it was revealing. I began to understand that my silence wasn't creating distance. It was revealing the distance that had already been there. At times, the urge to explain returned, disguised as kindness. I told myself I didn't want things to feel awkward, that I was being considerate by filling the gaps. But I started to recognize that urge for what it was. Fear dressed up as care. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being left in uncertainty. And each time I resisted that urge, I felt a small but meaningful shift inside me. The quiet forced me to confront a difficult truth. Being understood isn't the same as being valued. I had spent so much energy trying to be clear, hoping clarity would lead to connection. But clarity without interest only leads to exhaustion. That realization didn't arrive gently. It settled in slowly, reshaping the way I understood my own needs. I also began to notice how silence changed my sense of self-respect. Without explaining myself repeatedly, I felt less exposed, less stretched thin. My feelings felt more contained, more protected. Not hidden, protected. And in that protection, I felt a growing sense of steadiness that I hadn't experienced in a long time. The most surprising part was how silence changed my expectations. I stopped waiting for understanding to arrive as a reward for effort. I stopped hoping that one perfect explanation would finally make everything click. Instead, I started paying attention to what was offered without asking. What came naturally. What remained when I did nothing at all. By then, I could feel the story moving toward something inevitable. Silence had done its work. It had stripped away assumptions and revealed truths that words had kept buried, and I knew that the next part wouldn't be about whether silence worked, but about what it demanded of me once I finally saw what it revealed. Once the truth revealed itself, there was no way to unsee it. The silence had shown me something words never could. How little curiosity there was when I stopped providing explanations. I wasn't met with confusion or concern the way I had imagined. Instead, I was met with a kind of neutral calm. Not hostile, not cruel, just indifferent. And that realization landed heavier than any argument ever had. I noticed how my absence of explanation didn't create urgency. It created space. And in that space, priorities became visible. What mattered surfaced naturally. What didn't, quietly faded. I had always believed that if I stopped explaining, everything would fall apart. But what I saw instead was something more honest. Things didn't collapse. They simply settled into their true shape. There was grief in that understanding. Grief for the version of the relationship I had been trying to sustain through effort alone. Grief for the belief that if I could just say the right thing, everything would align. Letting go of that belief felt like releasing something I had been holding for far too long. Something heavy that I didn't realize was weighing me down. At the same time, there was a strange sense of empowerment. Not the loud, triumphant kind, but a quiet steadiness. I no longer felt compelled to manage emotions that weren't mine. I no longer felt responsible for filling every gap. The silence had taught me that presence doesn't require performance, and connection doesn't need constant maintenance to exist. I started to feel differently about myself. Without explaining, I wasn't shrinking or disappearing. I was becoming more defined. My thoughts felt clearer. My emotions felt more contained. I realized how often explaining had diluted what I felt, turning needs into requests and boundaries into negotiations. Silence gave those feelings back their original weight. There was also fear. Fear of what would happen if nothing changed. Fear that silence would confirm what I didn't want to accept. But even that fear felt different now. Less paralyzing, more informative. It pointed me toward truths I had been avoiding, not because I wasn't ready to face them, but because I had been too busy explaining them away. The longer I stayed with the silence, the more I understood that clarity doesn't always come from answers. Sometimes it comes from absence, from noticing what doesn't happen, from recognizing effort that isn't returned. Silence had removed the distractions and left me with something undeniable, a clear view of where I stood. I began to respect the quiet in a new way. It wasn't passive anymore. It was intentional, grounded, and honest. I wasn't using silence to test anyone. I wasn't waiting for a reaction. I was simply choosing not to explain what should have been met with care on its own. That choice felt like reclaiming something I had given away piece by piece. Looking back, I realized how much courage it took to stop explaining. Not because silence is strong, but because it forces you to face reality without filters, without hope disguised as effort, without words softening the edges. And in that clarity, I found something I hadn't expected: trust in myself. By the time I fully understood what that night had changed, I knew there was no going back. Silence had shifted something fundamental, not in the relationship, but in me. And as that realization settled in, one final question remained. Not about what the silence had revealed, but about what I would choose to do with that understanding next. If you're still here, listening to the end of this story, I want to thank you, genuinely. Thank you for giving your time, your attention, and your quiet presence to something that isn't loud or demanding. Stories like this aren't meant to be rushed. They're meant to be felt slowly, in the spaces between words. And if this one stayed with you, even just a little, it's probably because part of it felt familiar in a way that's hard to explain. If you're someone who has spent a long time explaining yourself, your feelings, your needs, your silence. I hope this story offered you a moment of comfort. Not answers, not instructions, but permission. Permission to pause. Permission to stop translating your emotions for others. Permission to trust that what matters doesn't always need to be explained to be valid. Silence doesn't mean you don't care. Sometimes it means you finally care enough about yourself to listen inward. Wherever you are right now, whatever you're carrying, know this. You're not wrong for wanting to be understood, and you're not weak for feeling tired of explaining. There is strength in noticing. There is courage in stillness. And there is peace in allowing yourself to exist without constantly proving your worth through words. Thank you for being here tonight. If you choose to return tomorrow, there will be another quiet story waiting for you. Another space to listen, reflect, and feel less alone.